Hey guys, my name is Shreyas and welcome to Simple Biology. Today we're going to be talking about homology. Now, what is homology? Homology is the state of similar structures resulting from common ancestry. So it's basically when closely related species share the same common ancestor and share the same features, but not necessarily the same function. Let me give you an example of that so you can understand. So if you look here, these three organisms are all mammals, and they all share the same common ancestor. Now, that common ancestor had a four-limb bone structure. Forelimbs are the limbs which are in the front. So for a human being, that would be our arms. For dogs, that would be the two front legs. Same thing for bears, two front legs. So that common ancestor had a forelimbs with a specific bone structure. Because of that, all the descendants of that common ancestor, that would be human beings, a few examples of that common ancestors of descendants, human beings, bears, dogs, all mammals, have the same bone structure within their forelimbs. However, these forelimbs perform different functions. Okay, so for human beings, our arms help us pick up things. For dogs, their forelimbs are used for walking. Same thing for bears. Bears also use their forelimbs for swimming. So, but that's basically what a homologous structure is. So, closely related species sharing the same ancestor and having features, but these features not necessarily don't have the same function. Homologous structures are structures that represent variations on a structural theme that was once present in a common ancestor. So again, these forelimbs that we talked about here are examples of homologous structures. There's actually two types of homologies. The first is anatomical homologies, and we kind of already talked about that, but let me get into it. Anatomical homologies are relationships in the structure of different species from a common ancestor. So the bone structure that we saw here with these organisms is an example of an anatomical homology. Another example for you here: bats fly and whales swim, but they both have the same bone structure, believe it or not, even though they're completely different organisms when you look at them. Because they're both mammals, they have the same bone structure. Another important type of anatomical homology are vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are structures with no function, but they are apparent from a common ancestor, okay? So, for example, the human appendix, somewhere down the line of evolution, one of our ancestors had a appendix. So because of that, all humans have an appendix. However, humans don't need an appendix, but it's still there because our common ancestor had it. Another example of a vestigial structure is pelvic bones of a snake. One of the ancestors of a snake had pelvic bones, so all snakes have pelvic bones, even though they're completely useless to snakes. Okay. Now, the second type of homology is molecular homology. Molecular homology is similarities in the sequence of the genetic code between organisms of a common ancestor. Humans and bacteria are very different organisms, but because humans and bacteria have the same common ancestor, they share similar genes. However, the reason why we're different from bacteria is obviously because although we shared similar genes, some of the genes obtain new functions along with original functions, and that's why we see the variation. Okay, but the genes which are similar between organisms represent molecular homology. Now, an evolutionary tree is a diagram reflecting evolutionary relationships among different groups of organisms, and scientists use this all the time. They draw evolutionary trees to try to represent the path of how we went from one common ancestor into all these different types of species. If you look at tetrapods are amphibians, mammals, and reptiles, including birds. They all share a common genetic code. They all have limbs with digits, basically like fingers or something of that kind, but other vertebrae do not. Okay, so that would be one leg of the evolutionary tree. And but usually these evolutionary trees are built on homologous characteristics. I have a picture of a evolutionary tree here. So you would have probably like a common ancestor at the root, and then as you see, we branch out into different groups of organisms, kind of like a family tree. Now there's two types of evolution that you need to understand: divergent evolution and convergent evolution. Divergent evolution is the process in which a species evolves into two or more different forms from a common ancestor. So divergent evolution would be like this right here, common ancestor slowly evolving into different species like a tree. Okay, so divergent evolution can lead into these homologous features, which you've already seen before. And again, we've talked about homologous features, so I'm not going to go again and describe that. Now, the other type of evolution is convergent evolution. So convergent evolution is when organisms not closely related to each other start developing similar traits as a result of adapting to similar environments. So even though these organisms don't have the same evolutionary background, because of natural selection, they're going to develop traits which are similar. Okay, and these features or these structures which are similar are called analogous features. Analogous features share a common function, but not a common ancestry. So it's kind of like the opposite of a homologous structure. Homologous structure shares common ancestry, but not necessarily the common function. Analogous features exactly the opposite. Common function, but not common ancestry. Let me give you an example of that. If you look at insect wings and bird wings, insects and birds are not closely related at all. However, because of similar environments, insects and birds have developed wings. So that would be an example of analogous features which have been formed through convergent evolution. Okay, that's all I have for homology. Please stay tuned for the next video, but that's it for now. Homology is as simple as that.